wishing you first and foremost a very, very happy new year. I know it's already end of January, but still, it's been a very, very busy beginning of the year for many of us. And I just want to really first wish you all the very, very best. And let's try to make this year 2024 a great blue year, if I may say so, year of the ocean and blue economy and for and by the people, of course. And of course, I want to appreciate the time that you are giving us to join us for this discussion today. And I do believe that it's a particularly actually sort of opportune discussion we're having because because we're just starting the year and we all know that, the ocean needs to play a critical role in that decade. And yet we are not seeing the level of traction and in particular the level of sort of commitment, financial, political, required to be able to achieve and unlock the real potential that the ocean can deliver for climate, for the people, and for biodiversity, really. One of the key sort of feature target that we all know relate to the ocean, but in fact not only, is the 30 by 30. And of course, even though it sounds catchy as a target, and we know that there is science behind that sort of underpin the need for us to achieve that targets, there is still lots of question marks, and maybe even more so when it comes to the Africa-Europe relationship and partnership on how to achieve that targets in a way that deliver positive outcome for nature and the people, or even more so for the people, by the people, including nature. Because ultimately, of course, we know that the ocean is also not only a place where the nature, biodiversity thrive, but it's also a way where billions of people around the world are actually directly depending on for the livelihood, for the life, for the subsistence, and rightly so. And so I think looking at these targets, I think for us, it would be extremely important to have that discussion early on in the year to find ways really and practical, very concrete sort of action-oriented ways that we can deliver in a nature, people, positive manner these targets, which again, we know how important it is, and it is certainly very, very high in the agenda of governments, of partners, of the civil society. And so that's sort of in terms of setting the agenda. Of course, this is in parallel, if not directly, should be put in perspective with the current traction and momentum around the blue economy, and how can the blue economy can support and accelerate, if not scale up, our capacity to deliver on the 30 by 30 target, and vice versa. Can the 30 by 30 target also help unlock the true potential of a really real, true, sustainable, regenerative blue economy? So that's in terms of setting the agenda. I'll stop here because I actually don't want to monopolize the discussion. I'd rather hear from you on what's your take on this, and how can we eventually pull our strengths together in the coming year to find ways to move the needle. And I'd love to give the floor to you, David. If you could, from your perspective, from Cordio's perspective, but also from, of course, you as being the chair of the IPBES now as well, having this more like global perspective, if you can provide us, on how do you think an expansion of the MPAs and really how can we meet the 30 by 30, while again, sort of making sure that makes sense, is realistic, is feasible, and respond to the needs and the priorities of the people that depend the most, as well as, of course, deliver biodiversity outcomes. And of course, if you can also maybe reflect a bit on how can this Africa-Europe relationship and partnership help move the needle. So over to you, David, with this very simple and small question.
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, indeed, a small question. So it's a pleasure to be here. So first, as Cordio, the kind of work that my organization has done based in Kenya and working on coral reefs is we're focused on coral reef monitoring and research and assessment of reef health and diversity, but also future prospects. And this we've done always with a view to informing planning and management of coral reefs. The key objective is to try and highlight the need to reduce drivers and pressures of decline as a focus for management. So reducing fishing pressure, for example, and of course now reducing the climate driver is critical, of critical importance in the coming decades. But a key part of that is also the attribution, identifying the different roles and responsibilities of different actors in achieving that pressure reduction. So the 30 by 30 target, so target 3 of the CBD, focuses on protected areas. And we need to increase the coverage of protected areas and the area of intact nature. But it'll be almost impossible to do that without reducing the drivers of decline. So how do we identify who's responsible for that? And how do we really promote the notion of sustainable use so that people who do need to use and extract resources and have rights to certain areas of ocean and of land, those rights are respected and really promoted in the governance system. And we work out how to make all of the different pressures on those spaces balance each other out. Now, it takes many different actors, and you asked about the relationship between Europe and Africa in doing this. And each continent or each set of countries and cultures has different things to bring to the table in terms of experience, in terms of knowledge, in terms of assets. It's worth noting that the coverage of protected areas in the sea and European continental waters, for example, is very low. Almost all of the area of large MPAs in the European system comes from overseas territories. And it's really important, that's to work out how to reduce drivers across the board in continental waters. We need to do that in Africa as well. But a lot of the drivers in our waters come from extraction related to fisheries, for example, with fisheries licenses, with European fleets and so on. So both sides of the table have a lot of things they can bring to bear in terms of identifying equitably, how do we reduce drivers? How do we expand the coverage of protected areas and of sound management, good management? And then what is the equitable sharing of finance, of reducing drivers and responsibilities and making this happen? And that needs coming to the table with a wide open slate to identify what we all need to do.
Thanks a lot, David. Indeed, you highlight the importance of reducing the pressure on natural resources from external, internal sort of pressure, threats, and other stakeholders. But also you highlight the importance of sort of securing the stewardship of the local stakeholders to actually be able to deliver on those management activities. And I guess sort of, my question is, how can we indeed support their leadership and their commitment to this kind of management practices and measures that need to be established to have actually achieved MPAs, not just on paper, but in reality. And I think that's actually a very good segue for you, Niaro. Of course, I know that you've been very much involved with communities and sort of really on-the-ground delivery and action. And I'd love to hear from you, if that's okay. At the community level, how would you communicate, the values of MPAs or LMMAs, with coastal communities, for instance, and how can this secure their stewardship and their commitment to actually sustainably manage them? And I think if you could also sort of reflect a bit on what David alluded to in terms of, benefit sharing, and how can they also benefit directly, and how can those MPAs and LMMAs respond to their needs and priorities? I think that would be extremely interesting to sort of put a bit of granularity to this discussion. Niaro, over to you.
Hello, everyone. So I'm from Madagascar. Here in Madagascar, we work a lot with fishermen, since Madagascar is an island. So yes, the marine protected areas and the locally managed marine areas are some kind of solution that we use all the time. So to answer your question, for my part, a lot of community participation. So we engage community members in the decision-making process regarding the establishment and management of MPAs and LMMAs. And we encourage active participation and involvement in planning, monitoring, and enforcement of activities. So this is basically the first thing we do, since we have to manage traditional conservation methods. and the new methods. So the second one is we have to use local language, and we have to be cultural sensitive. So what I mean is that if you go to the east or in the west coast here in Madagascar, you have to be aware of the ethnicity, of the culture, but also of the practice for in their land. So you have to communicate in the local language and be use the norms and practices they are using. So, well, if you don't do that, you can't work with them. So maybe you can do drama, you can use music and traditional ceremonies to convey the importance of MPA and LMMAs. Third, we also do demonstration and education. It's very important, but because we organize field trips and demonstration to showcase the benefits of MPAs and LMMAs in preserving marine biodiversity and enhancing fish stocks. So fourth, we also do economic incentives. So it means that we have to highlight the economic benefits of MPAs and LMMAs, such as increased fish abundance, improved livelihoods through sustainable fish practices, and we enhanced ecotourism opportunities as well. It's very important because ecotourism has a lot of benefits here in the country, and we have to emphasize the long-term economic gains and the resilience of coastal communities. So we have to be also flexible, and we use adaptation and flexibility. Why? Because we have to adapt conservation strategies to fit the specific needs and circumstances of each community. So each community is different. We have to take account that, and we have to respect existing customary tenure systems and traditional governance structures while integrating modern conservation approach. So one of the example is we do a lot of capacity building here. So we created a village. How can I say it? A village aquaculture. So it means that we have a lot of experts. They teach the communities about how to implement, how to scale up the fisheries. But the problem is that now it becomes a lot of conflict. There's a lot of conflict because the people who used to teach the communities how to fish is actually the one who set the price in the market. So it becomes more like an assistana cooperation, and it's not very relevant if you want to boost the economy of the island. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Niora. I think those are extremely important points. And indeed, you do talk about the need to respond to the needs, and including sort of the development needs and economic sort of priorities of local communities, local stakeholders, and supporting actually sort of the development of their livelihoods, but in a way that, of course, is compatible with conservation outcomes. I think that's also very, very important, because we do tend to think that economic activities or sort of use of natural resources is necessarily sort of a threat or a negative sort of pressure put on marine protected areas. But indeed, and as you mentioned, there is certain economic activities and even certain use of natural resources that can ultimately benefit not only the local communities, but overall the groups and objective of marine protected areas, of course, as long as those practices and that use of natural resources is sustainable and ultimately contribute to the regeneration of the broader seascape. You also mentioned the need to be culturally sensitive and actually to celebrate that culture of the local people and the local stakeholder. I think, the more and more, I see and I am involved in those discussions, the more sometimes I feel that we should actually not only talk about marine protected area, but maybe like marine and people protected area, because in fact, we are not only protecting the marine biodiversity, but also we are protecting the people, their livelihoods, their culture. And not only are we protecting them, but we're actually celebrating their traditional ways of living and their culture, etc. So I think that's a very, very important and probably sort of underestimated role of MPAs and the 30 by 30 targets. Now, I'd love to switch to you, Antonio. We know that you've been very much involved in MPA management and in particular sort of looking at researching on the effectiveness of MPAs, etc. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on, based on your experience and your knowledge, your expertise, is there any sort of, if you could share a bit sort of what are the key stumbling blocks to actually deliver effectiveness within MPAs, and more broadly, of course, what could be sort of the key factors of achieving a 30 by 30, not only on paper, but actually on the ground? And if there is maybe any sort of innovative solution or best practices that we could, integrate into our work more deliberately, maybe to ensure that we achieve positive outcomes. Antonio, it's over to you. Please come in.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation, also for the question. I think that nowadays there is a very large body of literature, scientific, illustrating the role of MPAs as a conservation management tool that can protect biodiversity, also healthy and resilient marine ecosystem, and as you were saying, as the colleague were mentioning earlier, also to provide societal benefit. In particular, the science shows us that when they are properly designed and managed, MPAs can enhance, for instance, the abundance, the size, and the biomass of the species living there. And this happens because, this is very simple. When MPA reduce fishing mortality within their borders, and so the individual species that are normally fished can live, can grow, and size and reproduce. For instance, in the Mediterranean Sea, a few years ago, we conducted a review and a meta-analysis, and we saw that on average, fish biomass inside fully protected areas is about 2 or 3 times higher than in controlled sites and protected areas. And this is a little bit reduced in partially protected area, but still significant because you can find double density and biomass compared to outside. But the point is not just protecting, single species. The fact is that when we are protecting and recovering single species, we are also recovering some ecological function. So this can have potentially also some ecosystem-wide effect. Just to cite an example, which is iconic in the Mediterranean Sea, but there are some similarity in other case studies. For instance, here we have a couple of fish, the sea breams, which have a key ecological role because they are main predators of sea urchins. The sea urchins are species which can influence the dynamic of the benthos, so grazing on the algae, and so creating what is called a barren. Basically, they are bare areas. So in fished areas where sea bream density is very low, sea urchins are increased in density and biomass because they are released from predatory pressure and they can graze all the algae and so create this barren area. While, for instance, inside the MPAs, where sea bream's density and biomass is much higher, they can prey on sea urchins, so reduce their density, and so this can drive the shift back from the barren to the vegetated habitat, which hosts higher biodiversity. So again, we're protecting one species, one function, but the effect is ecosystem-wide. And this generally actually applies to a lot of different species. For instance, large predators such as groupers, which are, again, are iconic species, and that MPA hosts very large density of very large sized individual, which is nowadays virtually impossible to observe outside MPAs. But I think one other important aspect is that MPAs do not deliver ecological benefits only inside the boundaries, but they can also export outside through, for instance, 2 specific mechanisms. One is the so-called spillover, which is the export of individuals, juvenile and adults, from the MPA towards surrounding area. This process generally occurs at a limited distance, let's say in the range of hundreds of meters or a few kilometers, depending on a number of factors of the species and the environment. And this can actually support, for instance, local fisheries. And the second process, which is happening at a larger scale, is the larval export. Because we said we are, inside MPA, we are protecting fish biomass, so we are protecting also spawning stock biomass. because we have like a number of potentially large-sized individuals that can produce a lot of eggs. And these eggs are larvae and they're exported outside the MPAs and replenishing this fishing ground. So again, this is a benefit that links also to the societal components and human well-being more in general. About the last part of your question, the innovative solution, actually, I think that probably we don't need much innovation because we already know what is needed. The point is that we need to implement it. So for instance, the MPA, we know that they have to be properly designed. So they have to account, for instance, for the ecological needs of what we want to protect. And they have to be large enough, for instance, to host the home range, the space where specific species live, or they have to host a certain habitat. They need to have proper governance, structure, and management plans that engage, for instance, local stakeholders, as it was mentioned just earlier. They need to be provided with human and financial capacity because otherwise it's impossible to make it running. And in the end, probably the most important thing, that the rules have to be enforced through surveillance, patrolling, and also convincing and discussing, engaging fish stakeholders, because otherwise, they're just on paper, as you were saying.
Thank you so much, Antonio. You do indeed, highlight the exponential benefits of MPAs. The more highly and strongly protected they are, and that's sort of better to thrive. The more sort of the benefits are important. So it's not like linear. It's and that's very interesting because then the other sort of component of it is that. I guess, and that's the whole sort of challenge, and I'd love to hear from Veronica just after that, but, how to balance this kind of ecological function being the more strictly and strongly protected MPAs are, the more exponential the benefits are, with the reality that there is actually people living in and or around those areas. And in particular, when it comes to the African continent, maybe even more so, that those people actually rely directly on those areas for their daily subsistence, for their livelihoods, for their needs more generally, and that's probably where I think we still have to improve a bit our way of designing, because indeed we can design a great MPA on paper that sort of fits the scientific sort of criteria, etc., the ecological connectivity, the needs of it, of the species, etc. But then we might not have necessarily been that great to actually sort of integrating the social components and how to secure that stewardship of local stakeholders in making sure that we can actually deliver not just on paper but also on the ground. And Veronica, maybe just to switch on that piece of content, because we looked at basically what are sort of the key factors of positive and successful MPAs and LMMAs. But from your perspective also, I'd love to hear, what would be sort of the key reason why MPAs could fail in fulfilling their original sort of goals and objective, and how do we grant conservation targets to the reality and needs of the different local stakeholders? How can we really secure that local stewardship? Veronica, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Well, I think there is not a unique or solid answer to this. And of course, when we are talking about communities, they are all very different, and different regions have different necessities, right? Also, like when we tend to talk about marine protected areas, there will be different, the oceanic protected areas than the coastal ones or the very large scale marine protected areas. So I would say it's a mix of all those factors. Some factors were already mentioned by Antonio, and we also need to look into the different phases. As you said, one important phase is the creation and design of the marine protected area. Yes, the ecological design of MPAs, it has been shown by science and many papers that is very important. And of course, it has been demonstrated that they are more successful when they are full no-take, the size is larger than 100 square kilometers, when they are well regulated, and when they have certain age, a bit older, like maybe greater than 10 years. But of course, also engagement with the stakeholders and all the different actors and sectors that can play a role are very important, because if we have the absence of stakeholders engagement already in the creation and design of the MPA, we probably will have a failed MPA. It's very critical for the success of the MPA that they start to be part of the MPA from the very beginning, because otherwise how people will accept regulations or even monitor and enforce those regulations, right? Another part, which is crucial, I will say, is the staff and budget capacity. If there is no budget resources, the effectiveness of the MPA or the long-term run of the MPA maybe is not visible. For example, it has been shown in the literature that MPAs with adequate staff capacity hold almost 3 times greater ecological effects than MPAs with inadequate investments in human and financial capacity. So this is also key. But if we go to the next phase, which will be the implementation, right? The socioeconomic considerations are very important to balance this biodiversity conservation with the socioeconomic needs, and incorporating these stakeholders is going to be key for the success. Plus, the people could also help to implement, to monitor, to enforce, because they also want those benefits for the area. One of the main problems is also overfishing by industrial fleets, and it's one of the major threats to coastal ecosystems, causing significant environmental impacts, but also socioeconomic. So, of course, the people that live there, that depend on those fisheries, are the first ones that want a change. So they need to be considered in every stage. And then for the last phase will be the actively managed MPA, which in my opinion will be a bit of a mix of everything, balancing multiple objectives, achieving economic, social, environmental benefits, but also I feel like if we represent all the stakeholders in the decision-making processes, this will lead to addressing overfishing, ensuring effective ecological design, and the implementation, and at the end, providing adequate resources and having a better MPA. More regarding to your last point about what concrete opportunities do I see, I feel like in the context of the 30 by 30 goal, it's a good opportunity to stop racing for paper parks and marine protected areas, but more quality marine protected areas. Separating a bit from, competing to each other's with reaching this 30%, which is something, but also we need to consider the effectiveness of these areas and how strict these areas are protected. We need to start prioritizing ecological integrity, stakeholder engagement, and the long-term benefits for both ecosystems and people.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Jim, you mentioned some extremely important point. You've started with the need to co-design those MPAs in India. I think this is absolutely critical because ultimately, and it links to your second point about the need to actually secure the stewardship and the co-management of those areas, if not the direct management of those areas by the local stakeholders. Usually what we've seen, and you highlight that in your remark, is that if that MPA or LMMA or whatever we call it is not owned and really led by those local stakeholders, then ultimately they will not contribute positively to its management and to sustainable management in the long term. Because indeed you did mention that the longer and the bigger they are and the longer in time they are implemented, usually the more benefits again are sort of exponential. So we want an MPA is not useful for just 1 year. The older it is and the more useful it is, right? Now, co-design, co-management, you mentioned also the need for finance. And indeed, as something that's probably here, there is a critical gap to be filled. We've been dealing with spare change, basically, when it comes to MPA and ocean conservation more generally. We do need to unlock a tsunami of funding so that we can actually have the means to deliver on the objective, including the 30 by 30, obviously. And that is something that we are still very, very far from seeing in terms of level of investment. But ultimately, I believe that, and I'd love to hear the other speakers' thoughts on that. But it's also maybe a question of narrative, because indeed, for people to really sort of be and countries to really sort of own this tool, which is ultimately a governance kind of tool, which are MPAs and LMMAs. It needs to respond to the needs of economies, national economies, and priorities, and of course of the needs and priorities of the local stakeholders. It might be something where, again, sort of talking more about the fact that we would protect the livelihoods, the culture, and the way of doing things of local stakeholders. It's something that I believe could also help strengthen the, let's say, sort of the business case of those MPA. And actually, sort of building on that point, in fact, we've seen that in the past, at least sort of past few decades, the MPA, the establishment of MPA, has been very much sort of top down, usually imposed by national government or other kind of stakeholders onto local stakeholders. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, Sabrina, on this. Among, of course, as I've mentioned, how do you see, how can we address these sentiments that government regulation or sort of external regulation imposed on local stakeholders, can actually sort of, how can we change that narrative, and how can we make sure that those MPAs and marine conserved areas are locally owned and led? Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that question. So I think before we get into that, we have to look as to why we even have these sentiments in the first place. And I will be speaking in a more South African context because my organization is South African. But I think if we look at the history of MPAs, there was a lot of dispossession that took place. I think we're all aware of that. And for example, just two examples would be Huleka MPA, which was basically an MPA where 450 families in their households were forcibly removed and the rights of the people there were not protected. Another example, for example, is Tsikama MPA, where the rights of the people were not protected. So people who would always go to the ocean to fish were suddenly not allowed to do that. So basically, we had this sort of top-down conservation approach where we would restrict people. And that is the history that we have with MPAs, and that is the history that is always at the back of people's head. And I think what's important to remember is that with environmental solutions such as MPAs, which by the way are fantastic solutions, it has to integrate people at the heart of it. For any environmental solution to be effective, it has to have people or the social impact. So I think that sort of disconnects what we had in the past, and it's why we had these sentiments. But going forward, we can actually change that. So I think with regards to how do we actually go ahead and address these sentiments is very important. So the first thing, in my opinion, and from my experience, is to recognize that we're actually both fighting for the same things. So the scientists, the policymakers, and also the local communities or the indigenous people, we both care about the ocean. We both want to protect biodiversity for current and future generations. So we are fighting the same goal. And the other thing that we have to recognize and come in with that sort of mindset is that we can both learn from each other. So the conflict is not about why MPAs are important. I think both sides of the coin understand why it's important. I think the issue is how is it implemented? And that's where these growing sentiments arise from. So with regards to addressing them, I think three main things. Number one is with engagement. So proper engagement with communities. And I'm not referring to the sort of checkbox exercise that sometimes happens with youth or with local communities, where these people are given perhaps a seat at the table as some sort of tick box exercise, but they aren't given the power at the table. And that's what I'm really referring to. So it comes to identifying the key parties. So is it the chief of the local community, whoever is a key player in the community? Second of all, recognizing agency. Do they actually want to be involved, and how do they want to be involved? And then lastly, providing them a platform to speak, but also in their native language to sort of get to their level and understand what they want and how they so far have been handling the MPA. So I think if we start properly engaging, we would go a long way. Another thing is to make sure that all policies, all regulations, any sort of laws cater to these people, ensure that they are written in those laws to ensure that we have a guideline to address them. I've noticed in South Africa, we have come a long way. A lot of our policies and guidelines, we already have that in place. So I think the issue comes down to the implementation. So can we give effect to the legislator's intention and make sure that we are actually involving these communities as we should? I think that's important. And in order to do that, we need to constantly be on the ground. We need to constantly research and make sure we are putting people first and we are understanding where they are coming from. And then lastly, just to end off on what I think is very important is this idea of co-creation of solutions. The people who are already at the MPAs, they already have a wealth of knowledge on how to preserve biodiversity. It is not only the scientists who know how to handle these issues. So I think if we integrate both parties, we can come up with really amazing solutions to ensure that we are protecting what we both love. I feel like oftentimes it is the scientists who will come and tell the communities how they should run. I know that we have addressed that and that we're moving forward, but I think we need to make sure that local communities are also at the forefront because they have just as much wealth of knowledge. So I think if we do all of those things, of course, it's more multifaceted, your question, but if we do all of those things, we're on the road to really addressing those sentiments. I think it's important to always remember the history of dispossession we come from, but I think it's good to know what happened in the past so we can move forward and make sure that going forward, MPAs are really just this integration between local communities and our scientists or policymakers. So we have a lot of work to do, but I think we are starting to step on the right foot. I hope I answered your question.
I think you made an extremely important point, and it's obviously extremely important and relevant and resonates in the African continent about the history and the background of the establishment of protected areas. And we all know where did that come from. Of course, it was mainly triggered by during the colonialist time, and basically hunters who wanted to be able to hunt their prey and do whatever they wanted, and basically they would kick out all the locals to actually be able to do their thing. And that's where maybe sort of you resonate or sort of you illustrate a bit more how important it is for us to start with the why and not just the how and the what. I think there's someone who says, people, they don't support what you do, they support why you do it. And because ultimately this is where people, they can sort of recognize and be inspired to actually sort of join a movement or fight against a movement. Now, I think as the conservation sector, maybe we've been extremely poor at actually explaining now why do we need to establish more MPAs and more LMMAs. I think there is still a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders, in fact, probably still the vast majority that believe that the why still is the same than in the 19th or 20th century. And in fact, it has completely changed. There is no current MPAs or protected area that are established, at least, at scale, for hunting purposes, right? that's something of the old world. And yet, I think there is still here a lot of work for us to clarify that position. And indeed, going back maybe to sort of the point I was trying to make, it's that should be communicated and explained that it is as much about nature than the people that live in those areas. And that's probably sort of one of the key ingredients to make sure that the people, they actually lead, co-create, co-design, and co-manage those areas, which ultimately is science, and there is thousands of papers that show that the most effective areas, protected areas, marine protected areas, are the ones who are actually led and co-managed by the local stakeholders, the IPLCs in particular, of course. And I think that's a very, very important point that you've made. Maybe, I'd love to hear from you, Kamar. We've talked, of course, about the role of local stakeholders and IPLC, but I think what would be your take on how can we actually also sort of leverage the energy and the commitment and the vision of the youth leadership to harness the potential of MPAs and LMMAs? And how can we turn, these marine conservation areas into opportunity for coastal communities and for youth in particular? Over to you, Kamal. Thanks.
Actually, I think there can be a leverage with respect to youth participation in MPAs. It is important for stakeholders to try as much as possible to do valuation in a way that they can show, they can clearly prove to governments and other international funders that the initiative is going to create jobs and is going to lead to benefits. I mean, direct and indirect benefits. It's a youth issue, and the youth needs to think about their future. The youth need to have a vision, and they need to see something sustainable from the action. It is very important that during conceptualization, the youths get involved. And here it's very relevant to use a participatory approach where we are going to be objective in the concepts, and the youth should have a place and their voices should be heard. The youth, they definitely will be asking themselves, what am I doing? If I have to preferably go into engineering in a university, I need to go into computer sciences, but how is protection of the marine ecosystem going to help me? And if definitely we can be able to show clearly to them that they are going to have jobs, that are going to benefit directly and indirectly, they are going to that's going to beckon on their interest. I would like to lay a little bit more emphasis on the aspect of fishing in the MPAs. When we are creating MPAs, we must think about free fishing zones. And if there are free fishing zones, the users are definitely going to know that there is an issue for them. There is an area for resource exploitation. Definitely, they are going to gain interest. They are going to participate in every action. Now, but then the issues of mining and mining and oil exploitation, that goes a long way to hamper the MPAs, have to be noted with seriousness, because fishing is dropping. I mean, the fish pool is dropping. There is an increase in temperatures. I mean, there is wood exploitation in many MPAs, and then if that is not being catered for, the youth's interest will be jeopardized in the nearest future. The jobs they need will definitely not be there. The benefits we expect will definitely not be there for them, and the youths are going to definitely feel discouraged, and they will not participate in activities around the MPAs. Remember, as conservationists, we speak a lot on issues on livelihood, but on reality, on the field, the livelihood is on a drop. Is dropping. It's not rising like we are claiming in most of our in most of our business plans and management plans of the MPAs. So that needs to be catered for, and innovative livelihood approaches brought on board to see that the youths can be able to, participate in MPAs. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those extremely important points, and sort of it goes back again sort of to sort of highlighting the importance of MPAs in terms of socioeconomic benefits, job creation. I think that's, again, it needs to be not just a narrative, by the way. I think it needs to be a very deliberate objective of an MPA and the design of its MPA, and finding ways that we can actually create and enable sustainable use, if not regenerative use, of natural resources to actually happen in those areas. That ultimately will support the creation of blue jobs, green jobs, whatever we want to call them, but also, and you point to that need also for us to make sure that those MPAs or LMMAs or large sort of marine conservation areas protect those livelihoods and those and stakeholders against activities, economic activities that can indeed hamper the capacity of an MPA to provide socioeconomic and conservation benefits. You've mentioned, of course, seabed mining, oil and gas industry, which we know, like more generally, industrial scale sort of activities have been proven to bring their set of challenges when it comes to conservation and climate outcomes. And so those MPAs should be very also deliberate in their capacity to protect livelihoods, conservation, biodiversity, and those areas against the negative impacts of those potential sort of activities. And that talks also probably to the point that you've mentioned also, Sabri, on the need to have the right enabling legal framework and environment and sort of political leadership for that to happen. Because ultimately, and you mentioned that also in your remarks, Sabri, on the need to empower local stakeholders to make the right decision and to be able to implement those decisions. And even sometimes it's not so much about empowering them, but maybe it's about stopping disempowering them and actually sort of removing ourselves or certain sort of stakeholders, legislation, so that they can actually do what they are best placed at doing. And so, I sort of putting this a bit into perspective, Gausu, I'd love to hear, from you, from maybe an African perspective, what do you think is needed today for the continent, and maybe also sort of tapping into this strategic partnership between Africa and Europe for the continent to really achieve the scope and efficiencies of MPAs and LMMAs, and of course looking at the 30 by 30 target, which we all know we're still very, very far from, and yet, and we have now 6 years left. We're in this sort of conundrum where we need to be far and fast at the same time. But usually we said that if you want to go far, you go together, and if you want to go fast, you go alone. But now we have to go far and fast. So from your perspective, what do you think is needed, and what are the opportunities? Thank you. Over to you.
Merci. Bon, j'ai à peu près compris, donc je ne parle pas anglais. Et puis, je sais que vous parlez des aires marines protégées. Donc, de toute façon, l'expérience qu'on a des aires marines protégées au Sénégal, c'est que c'est une initiative des populations en collaboration avec les autorités qui établissent des périmètres avec un décret présidentiel sur les aires marines protégées. Mais nous, ce que nous voulons privilégier dans les aires marines protégées, bien qu'elles soient participatives, c'est d'abord 2 éléments. Les études de référence avec les centres de recherche pour comprendre et connaître les espèces qui y vivent et qui y transitent, et les zones de reproduction. Et surtout privilégier la surveillance participative. Certes, c'est du domaine régalien de l'État, mais il faudrait privilégier la surveillance participative tout en formant les capitaines de pirogue qui pourront transmettre les véritables enjeux des AMP au sein de leur communauté. À peu près, c'est ce que j'ai cru comprendre dans vos discussions. Et voilà à peu près l'expertise que nous avons au Sénégal et que nous voulons démultiplier dans les pays frontaliers. Je rappelle tout simplement l'organisation que je dirige là-bas représente 29 pays africains. Et dans ce cadre-là, il y a certains qui veulent développer des aires marines protégées. Et nous, comment on doit travailler pour amener une certaine collaboration, un certain échange d'expérience vis-à-vis des pays.
You do mention in it. I'm sorry, we've run that panel in English. Je suis désolé, mais la prochaine fois on fera ça en français. Next one, guys, prepare and work on your French. We'll do it in French. But you do mention the need that indeed, we need to be as sort of demand driven and as sort of responsive to the leadership of local community, local stakeholders, and of course we need to be there to provide technical support, impetus, and of course the financial support to be able to deliver on that traction. Last but not least, I'd love to turn to you, Taraka, And we know that you've been sort of traveling around the world, trying to sort of really raise the importance and the profile of MPAs and LMMAs and conservation areas. You had, of course, an opportunity to engage with several ministries and local stakeholders, NGOs, individuals. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think based on that experience? He's sort of critical or sort of kind of instrumental in unlocking, leadership, and in particular sort of political commitment and political leadership to actually scale up and speed up the establishment of marine protected areas or marine conserved areas. And if you feel that there would be sort of specific synergies between Africa and Europe that we can actually sort of build on and maybe sort of unlock to, again, having in mind the 30 by 30 targets, which we are kind of running out of time to achieve it. So over to you, Taraka. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for the invitation to Sandanani and for all the input so far. So as you all know, I'm an ambassador of Blue Parks from the Marine Conservation Institute. So Marine Conservation Institute is one of the organizations worldwide that are providing the framework and are pushing a global MPA network. And just by looking at the numbers, only 2.9% so far of the global ocean are strongly protected. And that is the reason why I do rally for more strongly protected areas. To date, there are 3 areas on the African continent that have been recognized as blue parks, one in the Seychelles, another one in Tanzania, and another one in Kenya. And we have a blue spark that is like a blue park, a strongly protected area, scientifically also recognized with the Blue Park Award in the making, that is in Mozambique. I think also, as Antonio also said, we already have the tools, there's the government already in place, but what is missing is the proper enforcement, surveillance, patrolling, and also I think the problem that we all have is sufficient funds. And also, like Aro said, is to highlight the economic gains and benefits, the long-term resilience that is being built through MPAs. So what I saw when I was traveling to all these MPAs, when I was traveling 11 months and visited 17 countries, the first and foremost thing that I saw is that we need to, as also Pascal has pointed out, there needs to be the livelihood that is like the first and foremost the worry of the local population. They're thinking about, so what are we going to do if there's going to be an MPA? Well, how are we going to benefit from it? So, for example, there are a lot of positive examples that I have seen, like in Mozambique, ecotourism, diving, and how people can get involved in also providing, like not only the sea providing for them, but how they can actually help to love the sea and also provide like how to inspire other people to fall in love with the sea. Something that I also find I think, I'm getting a little bit tired, actually. I'm a political and scientist and a linguist. And I know that for you, it's very normal to talk in all these terms of fish stocks, biomass and everything. But in the end, it's living beings, so it's animals. And I'm also coming from something that may be not so popular in these circles, but I'm an animal rights activist. And I came from a human rights approach. I got to love the ocean because I came in touch with the wives of fishermen in Peru who were abused by their husbands, the fishers, because they couldn't provide for their families anymore because of, as Veronica also said, overfishing of fishing fleets in Chile. That was what was happening. Also, environmental degradation. And then I understood. And then I thought maybe aquaculture could be a solution, And then I thought maybe it's about providing only the livelihood. Maybe that's going to be better for the ocean. It's going to save the sea. But I think it's more important to inspire this love for the ocean through different kinds of skills. For example, what I really loved was I was at the Marine Megafauna Foundation in Mozambique, in Tofo, and they had the swimming program for the local population, for the local kids. And through swimming, and also I think Gaye also said that, It's to inspire and to let people learn about what is going on in the ocean, what kind of animals live there. And it's about changing, as you also said, Thomas, it's about the narrative, it's about the storytelling. And it's not about like setting up like top down these kind of management plans and say, okay, now you have to do this, without providing this kind of why and without putting this love into the hearts of the people. Why are they doing this? It's you can't order this kind of love like a recipe or something that is mandated. You have to inspire people. And so that is actually my main point, like how can we let people see the ocean for what it is, not as a kind of fridge or, some kind of treasure trove where you can go and you can get your resources, you can get your food, but be in love with the ocean and become an ally, So that's the main point that I'm trying to make.
Well, thank you for this extremely important point, Tarek, because I think what you're saying here is that we need to re-establish the balance in the relationship between nature and the people. So it's not just basically an extractive relationship that we should actually sort of promote. It's not just nature providing to the people, it's also people providing to nature. And that, I think, is certainly sort of underscored in a way by the fact that the industrial sort of revolution and the industrial sort of model of production is extractive. You extract, you transform, and then you sell and you make money. But it didn't used to be that way. In fact, when we used to have more like artisanal way of producing, the artisan is the one who is the best place actually to know exactly how to best manage the resources upon which it depends. And the other thing is something that certainly our economic model, our economic engine has lost, is the fact that ultimately the natural capital is the capital upon which our economies have been thriving, except that we've been eating it slowly, and in fact, to the detriment of future generation, which is also extremely unfair. I'm a dad myself, I have 2 kids, and I must admit that also feels very, very wrong in terms of generational justice, that we basically, which kind of parents would we be to leave a house in a worse state than the one that we've inherited, right? So I think it is about sort of taking this kind of perspective and re-establishing a healthier relationship between nature and the people. And I agree, there is a lot of love and kindness that needs to be re-established in that relationship that has been not necessarily very kind, nor full of love, but more about extraction, money making, etc. So it is also this kind of spiritual journey that we need to take. And maybe we need a new kind of revolution, maybe an artisanal revolution to sort of go to sort of on the contre-pied of the industrial revolution. Anyway, I know that we are actually running out of time. We're already 4 minutes past. I just want to thank you all for an extremely interesting discussion. I feel invigorated again to, well, we started the new year already like a month ago, but it still feels like it's still the beginning of the year. So I just wanted to thank you all very, very much for your time, for your ideas, energy, and commitment to actually be with us today. I highly appreciate the time and energy put into that. So without further ado, I think we're just gonna have to close here, even though I wish we could have like more time. But thank you all. I'm wishing you a great week ahead, and hopefully I'll see you very soon somewhere on our blue planet. Thank you all.